Okay, we are now streaming live on YouTube. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us and good afternoon. Welcome to the launch event of the UBI Lab Food. We are part of the wider UBI Lab network. So this event, as I've just mentioned, will be recorded and it is currently being live streamed to YouTube. So if you do not wish to have your face shown, then please do keep your camera off. So we are now a 40+ strong network of both geographic and non-geographic interconnected labs. We have spaces and places for discussion and debate about the potential for a universal basic income to revolutionise our current and conditional and failing social security system. Today, with the help of our amazing panel of expert thinkers, we're going to be asking the question, what role could a universal basic income play in ensuring nutritious and sustainable diets for all? In the current climate of rising food poverty and food bank use, environmental degradation, nutritional imbalance, income inequality, and increasing global food insecurity, our new lab rightly focuses on how a universal basic income could be transformational across the food system. We currently think of our food system as being farm to fork, and this produces a complex, interwoven and integrated system where people interact and become enmeshed within food. Simplistically, this can be through its planting or its growing, distribution, retail, also its consumption and final disposal. However, all along this path, food generates a different meaning to different people. The current capitalist system encourages us to seek and thus produce ever cheaper food, yet still requires producers to maintain the highest possible standards. This means that, inevitably, we are coming up against unsustainable limits. Many of these limits inevitably become externalized and work to really hide the true cost of our demand for cheap food. But we are here today to discuss a potential other way. And a UBI may have the potential to allow us to focus on not just simply farm to fork, but also to understand the power of investing in advance of the farm, going beyond intensive food production systems that capitalism requires for ever cheaper food. It may allow us to invest in real production methods and allow producers to produce the food which is better and more sustainable for not just them, but also for the community, the wider community. But it also should reward them with a fairer price for their produce as well. It also allows people a real choice. In our current unequal world, we know that we produce enough food for everybody to have a sustainable diet, yet this food is not shared or consumed equally, or even sustainably. On both ends of the food equity spectrum lies nutritional inequalities for those who consume too much, and also for those who consume too little. But again, we do know that there is another way. Now, given the rising cost of living crisis here in the UK, a UBI would provide people with financial shelter they need to buy food and not just have to rely on the ever increasing network of charitable food banks, which again were in the news yesterday. In the UK, we should still remain shocked by evidence that shows that in deprived communities, such as in Rhyl in Wales, there are more food banks than there are supermarkets. I think we should also remain shocked by evidence that also shows on a national scale that demand for food banks has risen so much during the last 12 years of austerity that we now have more food banks than McDonald's. But there is another way. And today, to discuss this other way, I would like to introduce you to our chair for this afternoon's event, Dan Crossley. Dan is the Executive Director of the Food Ethics Council, a UK not-for-profit working to unblock ethical issues relating to food and farming. Dan has worked on food issues for around 20 years including issues relating to household food insecurity. The Food Ethics Council put UBI in the dock a couple of years ago in terms of questioning whether and how it can help address some of the big issues we face in our food system. Hence, it's great to dive deeper into these issues today. And I would now like to hand over to Dan, who can introduce you to our panel of expert guests.
Thank you very much, Dave. Brilliant. Thank you very much for the invite to join. And yeah, good morning for those of you that are in over in the States or Canada, and good afternoon for those in other parts of the world, perhaps good evening as well. Brilliant to have all of you joining. What we want to do with this session is make it interactive, participative. So we're going to hear, I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but then after we've heard from 3 speakers in turn with some short presentations, provocations, then there'll be plenty of chance for the sort of second half of this for questions and discussion, inviting other participants in the room who I know have got lots of expertise to bring to this as well. So really keen to get you involved. So do please add, for those that are on Zoom live, do add your comments on chat. And if you're on YouTube, I'd love to add in your comments as well. We'd love to hear from you. Just a very brief word on us in UBI, building on what Dave said. We at Food Ethics Council, as he said, explored the idea of UBI in food a couple of years ago, and we felt it wasn't a panacea, but that it was a powerful tool, and that it needed people to dive deeper, as Dave said, into and explore it further, which is why it's brilliant. I'm really pleased that UBI Lab Food is launching today, and very happy to be part of that discussion. The 3 speakers we're going to hear from today, I'll introduce each of them in turn. We're going to hear from Elaine Power from Canada. Then we'll hear from Dr. Liz Kimani-Murage in Kenya, and finally Sarah Kloss-Davies. So the first person we're going to hear from, Elaine Power, is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario in Canada. Elaine is very kindly up very early in the morning in Canada, so thank you, Elaine. Elaine's been studying food insecurity for something like 30 years, getting on for that, and has been a long-time critic of food banks. Founding member of the Kingston Action Group for a Basic Income Guarantee, and co-authored the book The Case for Basic Income: Freedom, Security, Justice. So really keen to hear your perspectives, Elaine. So over to you for sort of 3-4 minutes just to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thank you, Dave, for inviting me, and congratulations to the UBI Food Lab. This is really exciting. In Canada, I think we're kind of unusually situated because we have our British heritage, and for most of the 20th century, up until 1981, we kind of followed the British model of using the social safety net to address hunger and food insecurity. And in 1981, we started importing the US model. We imported food banks. It was 1981 when we first established the first food bank. And just as you've experienced over the last 12 years, within a decade, they were widespread and firmly implanted. And it's just been heartbreaking, actually, to see what's happening in the UK with the destruction of your social safety net and the increasing reliance on food banks to address food insecurity. It's really been very distressing for me. I'm going to focus more on the low-income household and that component of thinking about the food system. And one of the things that I've learned from the many years I've done, particularly qualitative interviews with low-income households, is that they don't think about food as a component of the food system per se. They think of it as a component of their household budget and how to make their dollars stretch between, accommodation, utilities, transportation, clothing, costs for children, and so on and so on. And so food is often the only flexible part of the budget. And so that's why people end up going to food banks, because there's no money left after all the other bills are paid. And I think in Canada, because I understand, my understanding of the US is that they've used food as the solution to food insecurity for a very long time, as opposed to income. And I think we lost a lot of ground in the 1980s and the 1990s in Canada because we were thinking about food as part of the food system and not as part of the household budget. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about, developing food programs and more food banks and community gardens and such for low-income households. So I'm really excited to see this group attaching basic income to the problem of food insecurity, or what you call food poverty. Canada's had 2 basic income experiments. The first one was in the 1970s in a town called Dauphin, Manitoba. At least that was the saturation site. It ran from 1974 to 1979 and then got shut down without any evaluation. And in the early part of this century, Dr. Evelyn Forget, who's an economist at the University of Manitoba, went back to the 1,800 boxes of data that were collected and started doing some analysis. And I can talk a lot more about that if you'd like. The primary concerns then were whether women would leave their husbands because they had financial independence. The answer was no. Workforce participation, would people drop out of the workforce? That's really interesting result on that one. And Dr. Forget was also interested in the impacts on the healthcare system, which showed significant effects. Ontario has also had a basic income pilot, a much more recent one. It was launched in 2017 by a provincial Liberal government with 4,000 people enrolled. It's supposed to run for 3 years. So that, as I say, launched in 2017. In 2018, we had a provincial election and elected a so-called progressive conservative. It's very reactionary conservative government. And one of the first things they did was to cancel the pilot. So we had a tremendous opportunity that got thrown away because it was a very rigorous evaluation program that was set up for that pilot, including food insecurity. So we only have little bits and pieces of much less systematic data because the pilot was just over a year from the start when it was canceled. So what we do know from a convenience sample at one of the test sites is that of the people who had been using food banks before the pilot, almost all of them stopped using the food bank after they were on the basic income pilot. So that's one piece of evidence we have to answer the question of the day. There's also a huge body of literature from a group at the University of Toronto called Proof that also shows that income is really the only adequate income. Even small increases in income affect people's ability to buy food. So I'm looking forward to further discussion of this, and I'll turn it back to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. That was a brilliant whistle stop through some of the experiences you've had from Canada, which I think it's really important for us to listen to, learn from. It's part of the reason this discussion I think is really rich is that whilst many of you joining are in the UK, so it's really, really important that we don't think of the UK as an island, and that we still have an outward-looking approach, and that we learn lessons. And also really important for basic income. This isn't necessarily just a global north potential tool. So I'm delighted that hand over next to our next speaker, who is Dr. Liz Kimani Murage in Kenya. Liz is a senior research scientist, lead nutrition and food systems unit at the African Population and Health Research Centre. So it's a public health specialist with long-standing research on nutrition issues in Kenya and Africa, particularly around focusing on urban poor. Liz is leading work aimed at transforming food systems in Kenya and Africa to be more human-centered, resilient and sustainable, and wants to change the way that food is conceptualized from a commodity to a basic human right, a public good and a common good. Liz is a lawyer, a human rights defender, special interest in defence of the right to food, and leads the Zero Hunger Initiative at the APHRC, with a goal aligned with SDG 2, Sustainable Development Goals 2, around ending hunger and promoting justice. So brilliant that we've got Liz joining us from Kenya. I think just to share your own perspective, Liz, on particularly around how this fits with the right to food and what you're seeing where you are. So Liz, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So just briefly about the context of Kenya. So Kenya is a middle income country, recently reached the middle income level, but a lot of people live below the poverty line. And so there's a lot of high levels of vulnerability to food insecurity. The most recent state of the world, state of food insecurity in the world, that is the SOFI report 2021, indicates that close to 2/3 of Kenyans are food insecure, either moderately or severely. And also reports indicate that close to 15 million of Kenyans actually have chronic food insecurity. And and this vulnerability is actually even more in some urban populations, like in the populations where I work mostly. I work amongst the urban poor, and I have worked a lot in Nairobi, and the research we've done also has indicated that more than 80% of households in the urban poor settings are food insecure, and close to half of the children under 5 years are malnourished. So really, there is high levels of food insecurity. When we talk to the urban poor about food insecurity, about food security in their households, they tell us that food is available in the market around them, but they cannot afford it. So a lot of food goes to waste within their neighborhood, but they are not able to access because they do not have money. So really, as previous speaker has said, a lot of food is wasted. Globally, a lot of food is produced and wasted, while so many people are hungry. So really, the issue of equity, we don't have the issue of equity and food justice. And that's why it's important that we think about ways of promoting food justice. And we have the right to food in Kenya constitutionalized. We have it in the constitution, so everyone has a right to food. We realize, though, that we have to think of, we talk of progressive realization, but we need to move towards that realization of the right to food. Many people, the right to food is not actualized for many people. And so there is this, the need to really find ways of actualizing this. The universal basic income concept, it's new to me. I must say I'm not yet in the network for the universal basic income. And so I can see how it relates. It can relate to the issue of food in Kenya. And in Kenya, we have a policy around minimum wage, and it's capped at around $150. But this only is it's more just a policy, but in actual sense, not really implemented, because it only affects people in employment and more so people in the formal sector. So, which is about 1/5 of the population. So, this we can only say that only 1/5 of the population could be assured of this minimum wage of $150. A lot of people are unemployed, and others are working in the informal sector, and this minimum wage does not work for them. So, how I see this universal basic income concept and working in terms of food, promoting access to nutritious food in Kenya, we could link it to this minimum wage, and ensuring that each person can access the minimum wage, whether you are employed or not employed, so that people can be able to access food. We are talking of people in urban poor settings, 80% of households because they depend on purchased food, and the food in their environment, they are not able to access it because it's too expensive for them. So if they had this minimum wage, whether they are working or they are not working, I mean, we can talk of minimum income. for people, then we can say that people would be able to access food. Of course, this is so we are talking about so when we talk of universal, so it means that if you're employed or not employed, you at least have access to this minimum, like basic income, that you can be able to access food. So and that would mean then we can be able to have universal food access. The government taking charge of ensuring that the access to food is universalized, so and everyone can be able to access the basic food, because really a lot of basic quality and nutritious food. A lot of people also end up eating unhealthy food because that is all they can afford. So really, if we can be talking about this minimum income for everyone, whether you're employed or not employed, it could ensure that every person can have the right to food. They can choose the food they want to eat, and they are able to access it. And so then would be able to deal with the issue of food insecurity in our settings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. It's fascinating to hear perspectives from Kenya, from yourself, and rightly talking about issues about equity and food justice. Interesting to talk about, as you said, basic income and questions about real minimum wage, and we have the living wage and real living wage here in the UK. These are obviously all interlink, but thank you, Liz, really, really helpful. For the final speaker, wanted to come to Sarah, who's here in the UK. Sarah Kloss-Davies, who's a fellow member of the ACCA, Association of Chartered and Certified Accountants, and a member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Sarah is a lecturer in accounting and taxation at Bangor Business School at Bangor University, an active researcher focusing on real-life implications of tax and welfare policy on citizens, civil servants, society, and social equality, and on the effectiveness of social policy administration in achieving its intended aims. So there's a lot in there. I think Sarah, in particular, will talk about, I guess, one of the questions or challenges put to questions about UBI and basic income guarantee are obviously about the cost of this and the net cost and the benefits. So yeah, fascinating to hear from Sarah about some of the thinking she's been doing in this space. So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks Stan for that. Hi everyone, thanks to the UBI Lab Food Network for inviting me onto this panel. So yeah, first of all, in the interest of timing, I'm going to briefly mention some statistical data relating to finance and tax without much detail, but I'm happy to share references and elaborate later on if needed. Within my line of research, I regularly come across the age-old arguments: benefits deter people from working, and people on benefits are lazy scroungers. And a common argument I come across against UBI is that paying a fixed amount of money to everyone, no matter what their background or behaviour, would be wasted and used in unintentional ways, such as spending the money on gambling or alcohol or cigarettes. Well, these arguments highlight certain politically driven rationale and assumptions. One, that benefit recipients are able to work, but we know this is not always the case, as I have seen firsthand that not every citizen is able to work due to severe personal circumstances. And two, benefit recipients do not deserve a payout from the taxpayer's purse because they don't pay in to it. That is, one must behave in a certain way to deserve benefits, i.e., you must work and pay your taxes. This latter argument, which links into the concept that one must pay into society to deserve a payout, is quite a narrow-minded and monetized approach to how we govern the welfare of citizens, what we think of others, and how we go about our lives. But for those who support this view, some may not realise that over half of the UK population, 52%, are receiving some type of state benefits. The data suggests that a significant proportion of benefit claimants are those who are working, thus mostly paying income tax on their earnings. And for those who are not working, they are also paying tax. by, for example, VAT on the fuel, the food and the clothes that they buy. VAT being the second biggest tax revenue stream in the UK after income tax. More to the point, implementing a UBI has the potential to reduce government spending, increase tax revenue, improve the economy and the health and well-being of citizens. A good example of this comes from Australia, a country which, during the pandemic, paid an additional top-up payments for people on welfare benefits. An Australian citizen who was suffering from chronic illness received this additional top-up payment, and she used it to pay for gym membership. It also helped her afford to buy fresh fruits and vegetables and eat less cheap, unhealthy food. Over time, this transformed her from someone who regularly visits a doctor, swallowing a range of medicine, to someone who regularly visited the gym, swallowing healthy food. She no longer needed to use public health services as much because her health improved. So much so, it improved her self-confidence, leading to her getting a job. Thus, this extra benefit increased tax revenue through paying tax on earned income and purchasing goods and services, whilst also reducing government's healthcare costs. Unfortunately, after the Australian government removed this additional financial support, she was no longer able to afford gym membership nor buy healthy food. Over time, she was diagnosed with scurvy and malnutrition, malnourished in the sense that she was still able to eat, but eating the foods that lacked essential vitamins and minerals. She returned to visiting a doctor, was put on medicines, needing regular iron infusions and blood tests. She needed a psychologist because her mental health deteriorated and it meant she couldn't work. So this story also shows how a reduction in benefits reduces tax revenue and increases healthcare costs. But can a state such as the UK afford a UBI? It is estimated that a fully implemented UBI system would cost over £427 billion a year to significantly reduce poverty in the UK. This is roughly double the Department for Work and Pensions' current benefits budget. But we can't just focus on the extra cost it brings. We must also consider the cost savings it potentially creates, thus reducing its overall cost. There are several other options to help finance UBI. For instance, a subtle increase in income tax rates for everyone, a reduction in tax reliefs for, say, the rich, making UBI itself a taxable income, a windfall tax on certain industries, creating a new hypothecated tax similar to the recent social care levy, plastic tax and sugar tax we've seen in the UK. So these things are possible. Or restructuring the whole tax system by removing income tax altogether, perhaps, and charging VAT on all goods, including basic food items. Research on this has already been done in countries such as Switzerland, Canada, France, and Germany, but more research is needed, especially in the UK, that can also examine these options and anticipate any unintentional outcomes from such interventions. We could also consider making UBI universal to only a specific group in the population, which would reduce its cost. This concept has been done before in the UK. Take the child benefit system as an example, before it became means tested in 2013. But if we are to operate a UBI which is targeted towards a specific group of the population, we need to define who falls into that group and who does not. How do we identify these types of citizens? And how do we keep up to date with their circumstances to ensure they still fall into that group over time? How do we collect and capture this information in a simple, efficient, and timely manner? This leads me to my final thought. looking back at some problems of the British government during the last 40 years, the new introduction of poll tax, tax credits, and the abolishment of the Child Support Agency, to name a few, we must learn from these events, which are examples of implementing a new policy which turned out to cost the taxpayer billions of pounds, partly due to lack of consultation and research, plus careful planning on how it is to be administered at the front line was usually an afterthought. So when considering UBI, we must also consider how we go about implementing and administrating it at the same time, not later down the line, to ensure its effectiveness and efficiency is taking people out of poverty in reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Loads and loads covered there. Brilliant to hear. What I want to do is link that. There's a couple of questions have come in that in relation to, I guess, the cost and how and food prices and the sort of link between the two. So I'll come in a moment. I'll come to Reinhard Huss, I think, who had a question posed in the chat, but we'll give Reinhard opportunity to ask that directly live in a moment. But just to say to Sarah, there's a lot in there about, so thinking about the benefits of this and the potential cost reductions in other areas beyond the actual gross cost of it. And I think I should have said this up front, that many of you in this room, virtual room, will be experts in tax or in social security. Others of you may not be. Others of you may be just interested in this. Others of you may have strong interest in food and food sustainability, food justice. I guess what part of the beauty of this conversation is it's bringing together different people. But do add comments and questions in the chat if you can't, particularly if some of the language, sometimes I and others will use jargon. So if you don't know what, hypothecated tax, for example, is, a ring fenced, I guess the money being ring fenced for a particular purpose. But if there are phrases or things that you don't know what they mean, then please do shout. This is a safe space to kind of explore and dive into what we can do about that. So what I'll do is, I think with the power of people behind the scenes, we can ask Reinhard first to come in and ask a question that they have.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you, Reinhard.
Yeah, I'm Reinhard from UBI Lab Lead. I mean, I put a few questions in the chat, but I suppose you refer to the first one, because at the actual moment we have a sort of rapid rise of food prices in society. So I would like to know the ideas of the panel. If a UBI is implemented, how do they think could such rapid changes in food prices be addressed? Because often we speak about a fixed amount of UBI, but this may be, I mean, even after a few months already be insufficient in terms of the prices. I mean, this applies, I think, globally at the moment. As we can see, the prices, food prices are rising everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard. Very, very good questions. I'll come to the panel on that in a moment. So that question about linking to rising food prices, which I think is really important given the volatility at the moment. I just want to also bring in, if we can, there's another question about, I guess, about costs of UBI and what might an adequate UBI be. Slightly different question, but I think if we take that question from Mark, it was Mark Bryan, and then I'll put those two questions to the panelists in a moment. So maybe we could bring in Mark.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, so I'm interested in the potential virtues and benefits of a partial UBI, and so this question is prompted by the fact that in the UK we have some research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation about minimum income standards. So this is the amounts of money that you would need to cover basic needs and reach an acceptable standard of living, as judged by the general public. And the figure for food for an adult is £50 a week. So my question is, if we had a modest UBI of £50 a week, which just added on to everything else, so you'd keep the benefit system as it is, but just add this UBI of £50 on, would that be enough to eliminate food poverty and food banks, or at least the need for food banks? Or is that is that an overly simplistic way to look at it?
Thank you, Mark. So great questions, and I'll come to the panel on those now. And again, recognizing there is, you know, a lot of wealth of expertise in the room. So and I don't expect Elaine, Sarah, or Liz to necessarily have full economic analysis of those questions, but would be really interested to hear your views. Maybe Elaine, maybe we can come to you first from your experience in Canada. What, in terms of that, I guess Mark's question about sort of a partial, if you like, or relative, more modest, or probably more politically feasible, perhaps manageable basic income. What would that, and if you want, you can touch on the point about fluctuating prices as well, and how that might link to basic income.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. And I think the questions raise a really important point about what we mean by basic income or UBI. And in Canada, we're advocating for basic income that would allow people to walk away from really crappy jobs without having to worry about put food on the table. And so some of us are calling it a guaranteed livable basic income, but it would be targeted. It wouldn't be universal in the sense that everyone would get it. It would be universal in the sense that whoever needs it would be able to qualify for it, just like our medical system. So the question about, I think these questions really raise a really important point. One of the critiques of the idea of a smaller basic income is that it's like a very modest basic income, which is again what is happening in the US. Lots of cities are giving people maybe $200, $300, $400 a month, and it makes a huge difference for people. I don't know that it would eliminate food poverty, but if you're in a low-income household, £50 a week or a few $100s a month would make a huge difference. The critique is that it subsidizes low-wage employers, which I think is a fair critique. In Canada, we had the experience during the pandemic of what was called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which was implemented very, very quickly within a month of the onset of the pandemic. It was $2,000 a month, which $24,000 a year, which would be around the poverty line for a single person. It was implemented very quickly through the income tax system. People got the money direct deposited into their account. And so I think in the context of fast rising food prices, you could do that if it were done through, this was done through the income tax system, so that you could just have an inflationary component. Your month, if the inflation was up, then the next month the UBI could be adjusted. So I think that could be dealt with fairly quickly or easily. And whether UBI would impact the price of food, I think the price of food is probably, it's so dependent on so many global factors that I wouldn't think a UBI in a particular country would necessarily impact the price of food. There's been more concern in Canada about it impacting the price of housing, for example. If you had a UBI that was around the poverty line, that landlords might take advantage of that. And so I think it also points to the necessity for a lot of other regulations like rent control, for example. So I'll stop there. I hope I answered the questions.
Absolutely, thank you. What I wanted to, just before I bring in other panelists, just because you referenced a question, I think from Emily, just wondered if Emily wanted to ask, I guess, just ask that question or elaborate that question about UBI impact on the price of food. I think it's Emily Woodward-Essen from Public Health Wales. Emily, did you want to come in live just to add to that briefly before we hear from the other panelists? Okay, that's fine. So I've just been messaged that she's happy for us to ask it. So yes, that question is, how would UBI impact the price of food? So maybe if we come to Sarah, I think there's a whole bunch of questions in there, but I guess they all relate to. There's one about what's a feasible, would a partial basic income kind of work, and then two questions about how you link UBI to fluctuating prices, and then Emily's question about would UBI itself impact the price of food potentially, which I think is a very interesting question. Do you want to come in on that, Sarah? And I'll come to Liz in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're good questions to ask, and they are questions that comes to one's mind straight away, especially given what's happening now in the economy. We've seen, the rate of inflation go up, interest rates increase, etc. But when it comes to the cost of food, the rising cost of food, I suppose the question is that I would ask myself is, well, what's causing the rise in the cost of food in the first place? Now, some people, would argue, well, we've seen an increase in energy prices, in oil, in fuel, etc., and that trickles down to the cost of food prices. So that's one of the areas that are driving this increase in the cost of food. And so how would UBI itself affect that? I don't know. I don't think it would affect the price of food in that sense. Certainly, UBI would help provide security for people who are exposed to fluctuating food prices, absolutely. But would it change food prices? I'm not sure. Would be the quick answer to that. I don't see a direct correlation, strong link between the two in that sense, but it would certainly provide security and help people through that. Of course, as we say, the food costs and energy costs do fluctuate over time. If you look at the last 20, 30 years of fuel costs, they tend to go up and down quite a lot. So, don't quote me. I know we're being recorded right now. I haven't got a crystal ball in front of me, but I'm expecting that energy cost will come down at some point because history tells us it has. So I suppose in that sense, what we would need from a UBI perspective is a UBI system that is very sensitive to these fluctuating prices. So what I mean by that is we would need to design a system that is dynamic and that is able to, the government is able to quickly increase or reduce that fixed amount that we pay people if energy prices, food prices go up or go down, so that it reflects what's actually happening in the real world, if that makes sense. But trying to find an efficient and effective way of doing that is quite difficult.
Thank you. And it makes me think, sorry, yeah, lots of really important points that makes me think that, the adage that you may have heard others say, but I would support that, there's no such thing as food poverty, only poverty. But in that there are, we can't, if we're thinking about UBI, and one of the reasons why these labs are brilliant is because obviously the price of energy is important too, and the price of rental prices, affordable housing, etc. So what we need to think about food and how it connects with all these other issues, which is really important. If you want to come to Liz briefly, just on, I guess we've heard a bit about price, the cost of food and the cost of living and rising prices, and how that might link to basic income. I guess one of the things I'm interested in is I think this came out from what you said, is the talk of basic income is not just about the money, and the money is important, obviously, giving people that platform, that safety net to be able to, but it's also, there's something about, you talked about universal kind of access to good healthy food, and I guess it gives people more of a platform to be able to participate, if you like, in a way. Is that fair? What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so maybe if I can just talk a little bit more about the concept of universal food access. It's a concept about changing the narrative about food, from food being seen as a commodity to food as a human right, food as a common good, and food as a public good. And so really from the perspective of food as a public good is where the government takes charge of food, and it's not just being regulated by the market forces. So this issue, we are talking about food prices. If for example, within a country, the government is taking charge of food really as a public good, like just the way the water is regulated. Because now at the moment, water is a public good, and that's why we don't have soaring prices of water. So really, if that is how the food is also seen, then it would mean that we wouldn't have these soaring food prices without control. Well, so many people cannot afford that food. So that's the concept. And then food as a common good is where really it's not just that food must be accessed through the market system. There are other ways of accessing food within the community, people being enabled to also be able to provide food for themselves within the community, like some way of food sovereignty. So it's really a broad concept. And then the food as a human right, that everyone is entitled to food, despite whether you have money or you don't have money. So really, that is the concept of food, universal food access. And I think that's, when you talk about how this would impact prices, I think we have to think about it broadly, how these different social security measures work together.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, absolutely. Very, very well put. There's more comments coming in the chat. We won't be able to bring them in. We've only got sort of just over 5 minutes left of kind of discussion. I guess I'm keen to open it up for that broader discussion and then to bring panel members back. And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting here is, and we've talked a lot about, this comes through in one or two of the comments. Obviously, there is a direct thing about household food insecurity and the impact that UBI can and likely would have in addressing food insecurity more directly. But I guess interested about whether, so I think Lynn Sharp from Food Research Collaboration, City University in London, talks about, there are big lobbies behind that sell cheap, non-nutritious food, certainly in countries like the UK and many others, and that they won't disappear overnight. So UBI on its own won't solve nutritional issues, for example. I guess the point is that UBI, or basic income some sort, has potential to have lots of positive impacts, but it won't on its own necessarily solve everything. So we need to think about how it fits with other parts of the other policies and other parts of the equation. There's question, I'm going to, because of reasons of time, I won't bring you in live for the moment, but there's a question here about from Jack, interesting question, Jack Thompson. How do you think UBI could contribute to more sustainable farming? Which is an interesting one. Does any of our panel want to come in on that? I can see Elaine's got a raised hand. I'll come to Elaine first. Just briefly if possible. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Elaine.
Yeah, briefly. So the National Farmers Union in Canada has actually endorsed basic income, and they're a union of small family farmers that are interested in sustainable farming. And it's a national union, but it's considered, kind of more progressive than some of the other farmers. So they're seeing a real crisis in small family farms in Canada, with aging farmers and the difficulties of buying land. So they really see, just like for other entrepreneurs, they understand the basic income as a stabilizing force for especially new and younger farmers, so that they can take the time that they need, that they don't have to rush to make decisions that are less sustainable. So if anyone wants to contact me, I can send them actually a paper that I've written with an NFU farmer about this very issue. So the one thing that, again, sort of because basic income can't do magic, what we saw in the pandemic was that it was hard for farmers to get laborers. And so there would have to be one potential downside of a basic income is that it could make the situation for migrant farm workers even worse, because they would be even more exploited. So anyway, there's lots to explore there. But the short answer is yes.
Thank you, Elaine. And again, chair's prerogative on the broader piece about food and farming, and the impact that, I guess, if we think about food and farming workers, then the impacts on those, just worth flagging, again, as a UK stat, apologies for UK centricity on this, but that came out, I think, only yesterday from Food Foundation, that I think 24% of the recent survey, representative sample of UK population, 24% or over 24% of people that responded to it, of households where there was somebody working in the food sector had experienced food insecurity in the last 6 months. So about a quarter of people working in the food sector, or where someone in the household had experienced food insecurity. So this is a and we heard some, there are shocking statistics in the UK, as I'm sure there are in North America and in Kenya and many other countries as well. I guess just in the last couple of minutes, just want to do a quick whiz round each of the panel members, just for a kind of final closing word before I pass back to Dave. The question we started with, what role could UBI play in ensuring nutritious, sustainable diets for all? If there's one thing that you would like the audience to go away with, or the audience to go away and think about, or something that you think needs exploring further. This is a big topic. We've only scratched the surface of bits of it today, but there's one thing you think is really important for this lab to dive into, to try out, to experiment, to connect up with. What would that be? Maybe if I start in reverse order with Sarah, and then Liz, then Elaine.
Okay. Oh, no pressure then. Right. Okay. I suppose for me, it's to look at the bigger picture, to see how, because of course today's session we're focusing on food, but to think about, the trickle effect and how just looking at that, actually it links into other areas of one's life as well, and it links to other policies. And so if we look at the bigger picture, then it's probably going to create a more efficient and effective system. And I hope that what I said earlier gives you a good example of that, from the Australian person who, it was just gym membership and that extra income. So she didn't invest in food so much, but just going to the gym, starting to eat healthy food. And it's just the trickle effect on that made such a difference.
Thank you, Sarah. Liz, do you want to come in on what would be your one message, or what do you like to see further working, or what's your one key take-home message for people?
Yeah, so for me, I see the UBI could be a way of really ensuring that people have access to food of acceptable quality. One of the things that we see is that people, especially the poor, just eat whatever they're able to access because they can't access what they want or what they would prefer. So really that gives them the leeway to choose what they want, and so it really promotes food sovereignty. So really we would, but in a context like Kenya, with all these developing countries, the point about, do you do this at the whole population level, UBI for everyone, or is it, do you choose like people below the poverty line and decide that those are the people to access this UBI? So really, I think there is a question there that needs to be answered. At what level do we employ the UBI? But I see that it's really an important, it's important in this context to really promote the right to food.
Thank you, Liz. Absolutely. And finally, just briefly, Elaine, finish us off.
Yeah, I would echo the comments of the previous two panelists. I'm really excited that the Food Lab is part of this bigger network of UBI labs, and as Liz was just saying, it's important to think about the bigger picture. In Canada, we're trying to make really strong links with the idea of a just transition away from the carbon-intensive economy, and I suppose I'd just like to close with the words of Naomi Klein, who's an activist for humanity and the planet, and she was in her book "This Changes Everything" about capitalism and environmental degradation, climate change. She said, basic income has the potential to kind of break the stranglehold that neoliberalism has had on our imaginations. That it's all up to us as individuals. That basic income could help put us all back in a collective boat, so that we can start thinking collectively again. And I guess that's more philosophically, that's my bigger hope, that it can help kind of keep cracking the kind of neoliberal political ideology that's had us in its grip for far too long.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elaine. Final thought from me, then I'll hand back to Dave just to close out. But we've heard from three amazing speakers, and firstly, massive thank you to Elaine, Liz, and Sarah, and everyone else for contributing. It's been brilliant I know it feels like the start of, and it's supposed to be the start of conversations and trials and pilots and research. So kind of this, we're not solving everything today, but it's been brilliant to hear your perspectives. What I've heard is reinforces and builds off some of the stuff we did a couple of years ago, but this idea that yeah, UBI does have the potential to make a big contribution, not just to addressing household food insecurity, which on its own makes it worthy of doing, but worthy of considering, but also has potential much wider benefits about better access to healthy diets, reducing the need for food banks and emergency food aid, enabling investment in new enterprises, changing livelihoods, anyway, a whole bunch of other stuff that. But at this point, Liz made this point about food. Good food is a basic need and a basic right, fundamental right. So I think that's a good point on which to leave it. That how empowering people, giving them the agency and dignity, if you like, within the food system. It's not just about money, but I think basic income can go a long way to giving people a platform to be able to participate. With that, yeah, a huge thank you to everyone, and good luck to the lab. Keen to be involved and see how it develops. And I'll hand back to Dave to close us out.
Thanks very much, Dan. And as with our chair, Dan, and the UBI Lab Network and the UBI Lab Food, we would really like to also thank our panel for their thoughts and, especially their time today. And as our opening question asked, what role could a universal basic income play in ensuring nutritional and sustainable diets for all? I think we're starting to see that there is an alternative to the current food system. I think it's one that seeks to empower all people across the food system. So perhaps food inequality features as part of your work, or maybe perhaps it doesn't. But as our expert panel have discussed today, food really does play a role in all of our lives. And the way that we think about the true cost of food inevitably asks questions of power, of resources, of time, energy, and money. And with that in mind, and if our discussion today has got you hungry for more, we at the UBI Lab Food would be very happy to hear from you again, and would like to invite you to be involved in our future events. We plan to hold a series of regular events looking in detail at specific parts of the food system and questioning the potential future role for a UBI. But not only that, we're also actively looking for more people to come along and join our discussion and to be part of our network and the wider network as well. So whether you've got an expertise in any part of the food system because it's your job, or whether you are just a person who enjoys food and you can see the benefits of doing food a different way, we would love to hear from you and for you to join us. There are many ways in which you can do this too. We're looking for people to join our steering group, to be part of the wider UBI Lab network. We're also looking for people who may, just want to join in a smaller role, such as following us on Twitter and sharing our news, talking about us to your friends in the pub. However you choose to be involved, we'll have a space for you. So please do get in touch with us via the UBI Lab network, as you can see the details there on the screen. And I'd like to thank you all once more. And I'd like to thank our panel and our chair. And we look forward to seeing you all again sometime soon. Thank you very much.